Hello and welcome to week 2 in social psychology, and I want to start off this video right off by saying I'm having some technical issues with my camera switcher computer setup, so if the screen goes blank for a second, I'm working on it. I'm trying to figure out what that is, a bad cable or something. I don't know what it is, but seems to be okay right now, so let's carry on. Here in week 2, we are going to be doing 2 chapters, and pretty much for the rest of this semester, we're going to have 2 chapters per week. So we're looking at both chapters 2 and 3, and so the expectations, pretty straightforward. Chapter 2 and 3 all have to do pretty much with research methods and statistics. At this point, if you've taken any number of psychology classes, you know chapter 2 is always about research methods, regardless of what topic you're talking about. So here we go. Chapter 2, another review of research methods. It's probably good to recognize that they repeat this because it's so important. Now we go launch right into the goals of psychology that you probably learned at Intro to Psych, and that was to describe, explain, predict, and control human behavior. Now we're looking at that behavior in context. Like we've been talking in the discussion last week, the difference between this class and other classes, and they intertwine. It's not that that doesn't happen, and certainly if you've taken my classes, I integrate context a lot. I take sociology and I add it to psychology all the time. This class does it very intentionally. We're looking at human behavior in context, in relation to other people. So that whole dynamic gives us the world of social psychology. So we are describing, explaining, predicting, and controlling human behavior in context. So we're taking those other variables into account. As with all of psychology, we're using the scientific method to measure things. However, there are concepts within social psychology that challenge the observed data only sort of perspective. There's many things that we infer are going on in the mind because we take indirect measures of those things. So if we're going to measure something like attitudes, perceptions of beauty, and all that stuff, those things that are in social psychology and very important concepts within that field, oftentimes we have to measure those indirectly. We'll put people in test situations, see how they act. We ask them to report out. There's always some iffy quality about that kind of data. We're clever about the way we do our experiments and our studies and our observations, and we try to infer what's going on inside a person's mind by what we can observe in their behavior. So always a challenge. The other challenge is because this particular field looks at things like prejudice, attitudes, opinions and stuff like that relating to the outside world, very conscientious of the fact that some of these issues are not things that people would want to have revealed about themselves or studied or anything. So when it comes to informed consent, when we're looking at some of these, not all of them, but when we're looking at some of these kinds of topics, informed consent can be done without revealing the true purpose of the experiment. This is done very carefully. When individuals want to study, say, something like acts of prejudice or race violence or something like that, they want to study one of those things, they might go in and collect data without informing the individuals exactly what they're looking for, because those individuals' behavior might change. They might not want those things revealed about themselves. The criteria for doing that, basically not telling your subjects what you're doing, is very exact and has to be reviewed by an external committee to make sure that we're causing no harm. Some of those original ethical issues start to come up, and we have to address those if we're going to be doing that kind of work. Now, oftentimes there's a period after the study in which we reveal the true intent of the study, and that will allow us to kind of debrief those individuals. So now, oh, that's what you were looking at, you understand? But you could probably tell, you know, people feel tricked, they feel misled, all this stuff. So we approach those things very carefully. Luckily for this class, I'm not going to have you be doing any of those kinds of studies. You might be doing some observation. If you're a psych major, you're probably a people watcher. So you're doing this all the time, you know, out in public settings. One of my favorite things to do. Last night, I went to see Sting in Bangor, and Sting is my favorite artist of all time, and I spent a lot of time people watching. I spent a lot of time just looking at the facial expressions of the artists that were performing, looking at the interaction between Sting and his son, who was the opening act. He came up on stage, sang a song with them, and just watching them interact, I find that fascinating. It was almost as good as the music, almost. So just the kind of observation that we can do, that really doesn't run us into trouble. Those are public behaviors or whatnot. But it's just one of those things that comes up a lot in social psych, comes up in abnormal psych too. That question of being upfront about the purpose of the study comes into our ethical considerations. Now for chapter 2, we have a discussion and a quiz. The discussion goes into measuring these non-obvious, or what I put, non-conscious variables. How do we measure those things? And I want you to speculate how you might read the material and then speculate, maybe look it up. Look up some examples of how do we measure non-conscious variables like hidden bias and prejudice, and I'm using those a lot. There's lots of other variables. How do we actually measure that? And in the quiz, I'm simply asking, why is informed consent important? So it's a very, very critical part of the scientific method that we are upfront with people, even though, as I just said, you know, there's times in social psychology where we keep our true intentions hidden. We then go into chapter 3, statistical thinking. Now, this is kind of like data-driven decision-making, or using numbers to make decisions. And this is vital in the field of psychology, because when we do those casual observations, we have a tendency to generalize and say things about groups of people because we've observed just a few instances. Now, one of my favorite statements out there is, when we observe somebody, or we have a friend, or even ourselves, act in a certain way, and we decide to determine for ourselves what brought that about, what's the causal factors of that, then that's called anecdote data. Anecdote is a single story of somebody's experience. So let's say I had an uncle that had a substance abuse problem. He went to AA, didn't work. He's still drinking. AA doesn't work. I could draw that conclusion. And then that's anecdotal data. That is a single instance. Now, even if we have a lot of stories, all those anecdotes do not add up to data. So the statement that I like is the plural, multiple anecdote, the plural of anecdote does not equal data. So the screen went blank there for a second, so just carry on. We're doing well. The plural anecdote is not data. So our collective personal experience and case studies is not enough. So we look at variables, variation in distribution, statistical significance, and null results. Those are all part of this using data to truly understand the world. How generalizable is something, and then truly looking at cause-effect. Are we looking at cause-effect between two variables, or are we looking at correlation? You know, again, one of those other statements, correlation is not causation. Two things moving together in some predictable way doesn't mean that one causes the other. So all of these things are important things to refresh in your mind as you venture forth in the study of social psychology. The discussion here is the correlation with persons and viewpoints. And what I want you to to look at is I've included an additional link in the timeline to a newsletter that I subscribe to by Isaac Paul called Tangle. And he goes in there, and politics certainly is within the realm of study within social psychology, and the sort of the schism in America of left and right is really prominent and very destructive, and it ruins Thanksgiving for some families, because one person's going to show up and they're really, really extreme in one way, and they like to discuss it and stuff like that. However, there's an article by Isaac Paul where he interviews another guy, a historian, and talks about the myth of left and right. And oh boys, it's mind-blowing there, that it's issue by issue. We should be discussing issue by issue rather than left and right, because left and right is a result of tribalism, us just grouping together things because a group of people likes to group those things together, and we call that left and we call that right, but they're not really left and right when we look at the original definitions of what does left mean and what does right mean. And so for me, it was a very interesting counter argument to this whole idea that these issues our opinions on issues that are grouped together in left and right don't necessarily truly represent left and right. That's me. Read the article, incorporate that into your discussion for chapter 3. And in chapter 3 assignment, I'm having you look up an article in our database. This is a peer-reviewed article in the database here at KVCC on something related to social psychology, and you're doing a review of that article. If you are unfamiliar with our library system, this is a time to reach out to your friendly local librarian. Steve and Barbara, who work at our library, are very adept at working with psych students to find interesting information and making sure that what you're looking at is actually peer-reviewed. Professional article. They're hard to read. This is not your first rodeo. I know that. I know that you've looked these things up, but if you're kind of new to that whole idea, maybe you haven't taken a lot of psych classes yet, understanding how to read the research itself, the primary research, is a critical aspect to becoming in that psychological mindset that we've been talking about right from chapter 2. So get into that early, because it's due at the end of this week. Get to the library. It's online. You can reach out to the librarians online. Say, I got this assignment. Kavanaugh gave it to me. I have to find an article in social psych. It has to be peer reviewed. Help, and they will help you. The topic of it can be anything. You can look forward in the course book, look at what's there and find something interesting about social psych, and then look up those keywords and find something, current that's going on with that, and finish that assignment. All right, so that's your expectations for this week. The black screen, sorry about that. Again, I probably have to get a new cable, and I'll see if I can fix that by next week. And have a great week, and I will see you on the discussion boards. And looking forward to your adventure into peer-reviewed articles. So take care.